Good day. The last 24 hours have highlighted the extraordinary difference in terms of media coverage of the war in Ukraine. And not just media coverage, but also coverage by bloggers, by all sorts of people who cover the war and discuss it in various fora. Firstly, we have had lots of reports from the Russian side, from the side of the Donetsk People's Republic, from Western reporters who cover the war from the Donetsk side, the Donbass side, by which I mean not necessarily that they are aligned with the Russians or with the Donetsk People's Republic, but that they are actually physically present in the Donbass and visit cities and towns and settlements under Russian or Donbass control. Anyway, from their discussions, from their reports, one of the big events that took place yesterday, the one that's attracted by far the most attention, is the heavy shelling of the city of Donetsk, the capital of the breakaway Donetsk People's Republic, by the Ukrainian army over the course of several hours yesterday. By contrast, if you go to the Western media, you will see no coverage at all of this heavy shelling of Donetsk. Instead, the focus remains on the Battle of Severodonetsk. Now, I'm going to here state what I believe to be fact, and I follow every side. I try to stay on top of everybody's reports about what's going on over the course of this fighting. I obviously look at all the various big media sites, and I also make an effort to inform myself about what both the Russians and the Ukrainians, mainly, I should say, bloggers and independent journalists, some of whom I've discovered are fairly reliable on both the Russian and Ukrainian side, what they're reporting. And I have no doubt whatsoever that the heavy shelling of Donetsk that has been reported by the Russians actually did happen, and that it was, in fact, shelling directed to Donetsk by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians seem to have used a lot of the artillery provided to them by the Western powers to carry out the shelling, and it was done for no military reason that I can see. There doesn't seem to have been any military rationale behind the shelling, but as a number of people have pointed out, the shelling was extremely intense at one point. It took place on an extraordinarily intense level, suggesting that large numbers of separate artillery units were involved in carrying it out. That in turn suggests a coordinated plan, clearly an order, a formal order to carry out the shelling. And I'm at a complete loss to understand what kind of military logic there is to it. Because the city that was being shelled, Donetsk, is of course the capital of the Donetsk People's Republic. But as has been pointed out by various people, the shelling that took place happened at the extreme range of the artillery, the Ukrainian artillery that carried out the shelling. That makes precision strikes against military formations in Donetsk all but impossible, which also gave the shelling a distinct, indiscriminate character. Now, I am going to say straight away that I think this is completely wrong. I think this is entirely immoral. We're getting scattered reports that something like 8 civilians were killed, which, given the intensity of the shelling, seems remarkably few, but that may be only a preliminary number. If it was so few, that probably speaks of the effective evacuation of Donetsk by the Donbass, the authorities of the Donetsk People's Republic. And it might also suggest, by the way, that there was some effect that some of the air defences of Donetsk, which were apparently able to intercept some of the missiles that were launched at the city, that they might have been effective as well. But regardless, the measure of these things is not the number of civilians killed, it is the intention behind these kind of strikes. And I have to say, when a residential area is attacked in this fashion, it's shelled in this fashion, I personally find it extremely difficult to believe that the intention isn't to kill non-combatants. I mean, I cannot see what other possible purpose or logic there is to that. Now, of course, indiscriminate shelling, indiscriminate bombing has happened in a great many wars. The Allied powers famously did it during the Second World War in their bombing of German cities. But I think most people would say that carrying out a shelling attack like this, which has no military rationale, is profoundly immoral, and I suspect that it is contrary to the laws of war and humanitarian law, and is quite probably a war crime. I'm not going to discuss this further. I don't like to discuss these topics in detail. I will say that the failure of the Western media to report on the shelling of Donetsk, frankly, speaks volumes about the distorted account of the war that people in the West are getting. Anyway, that's about the shelling of Donetsk. The other story, the story about the fighting in Severodonetsk, which is still dominating the Western media, is, in my opinion, an even stranger story, because I'm not actually convinced that there was a lot of fighting in Severodonetsk yesterday, or at least over the last 24 hours. As far as I can see, the Russians have captured the whole of the residential areas of the city. In other words, they have captured the city itself. There are several hundred Ukrainian troops in the Azot chemical works, which is actually outside the city, but within its regional urban boundaries, if one can say this. There's apparently a certain number of civilians there as well, but I don't actually see much evidence that there's been a great deal of fighting between the Russians and these Ukrainian troops at the Azot factory. In fact, the impression I get is that what the Russians are trying to do is the same as what they tried to do in the siege of the Azovstal steel works in Mariupol. They're trying to get the civilians to leave the factory under safe conduct, and they're also trying to get the Ukrainian troops to surrender, to lay down their arms. And in fact, earlier today, the day when I'm actually making this program, there was confirmation from the Russian side that they've actually created what they call a humanitarian corridor to allow the civilians to leave the Azot factory, but they've renewed their demand that the Ukrainian troops in the Azot factory must lay down their arms and do so by tomorrow, or face presumably face destruction. Anyway, that's an interesting fact, because again, if you go to the Western media coverage over the last couple of days, you would come away with the impression that immense and bitter battles are taking place in Severodonetsk. Well, perhaps there's some skirmishing going on around the Azot chemical factory, but it seems to me that the reality is that the actual fighting in Severodonetsk itself is all but ended. Now, whilst I'm on the topic of Severodonetsk, I should say that in a previous video, I said that the Ukrainian troops in the Azot chemical works had been cut off because the Russians had destroyed the last bridge linking Severodonetsk to the neighboring city of Lysychansk across the Seversky-Donetsk River, Lysychansk still being under Ukrainian control. Well, the Russians have actually now denied that it was they who destroyed the bridge. They say it was the Ukrainians who did. I'm not going to judge on who's right or wrong, who's telling the truth about this. As I said, I'm not there. I'm not in a position to say one way or the other. The fact is, the bridges have all been destroyed. The troops and the civilians in the Azot chemical works are now cut off from the remaining Ukrainian forces in Lysychansk, and the Russians have created this humanitarian corridor for the civilians to leave, and they've called on the troops to surrender. Whether the civilians do leave and whether the troops surrender, of course, remains to be seen. But let me again reiterate, I don't think there has been very much fighting in Severodonetsk over the last few hours, despite what the Western media and indeed the Ukrainian government have actually been saying. Now, that doesn't mean that there hasn't been a great deal of fighting going on across Donbass. In fact, my impression is that the fighting is steadily intensifying, that the Russians are actually concentrating ever greater numbers of troops into northern Donbass. It's unclear, of course, exactly how many Russian troops there are, but I'm getting reports now that the Russians have been able to cross the Severodonetsk river, which of course the water levels have fallen because it's now summer, that they've been able to cross the river in multiple places, and that they are now approaching Slavyansk, which is the northern city in the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, where many Ukrainian troops, most of the Ukraine's Donbass army, is located, that the Russians are now approaching it from several directions, and that before very long the city will indeed be under siege. And it's indisputably the case that Slavyansk is now well within shelling range of the Russian army, and the Russians have indeed been shelling Slavyansk, or at least the Ukrainian forces in Slavyansk, sporadically at an increasing rate. And this is only one battle, obviously, in Donbass. There have been lots of others. In fact, I'm losing count of the number of cauldrons and mini cauldrons, in other words, encirclements of Ukrainian troops that is taking place. But it's becoming increasingly clear that the Ukrainian army in northern Donbass is being divided up into ever smaller penny packets, and each cut off from each other, and each cut off increasingly from any hope of reinforcement or resupply. And it's highly likely that we will start to see a steady breakdown of the Ukrainian forces in northern Donbass at some point over the next few days or weeks. I would add that the city of Lysychansk, the neighbor city to Severodonetsk, remains the only important city in Lugansk region which continues to be under Ukrainian control. The reports I'm getting is that one of the two main roads from which the Ukrainians have been using to transport supplies into Lysychansk is now essentially cut. The Russians had fire control over this road for a fairly long time, but the Ukrainians were still able to send occasional troops and vehicles at great speed along it and into Lysychansk. But apparently the Russians have approached this road even more closely, and that now traffic along this road has essentially ended. There is another road which enables the Ukrainians to continue to send reinforcements into Lysychansk, but apparently that's becoming increasingly unsafe and may also be closed as well. Now, amazingly and bizarrely, the Ukrainians again reinforced their forces in Lysychansk. Apparently they sent a unit of 80 men, maybe not a large number of men relative to the size of this enormous battle that's taking place in Donbass, but at least it was a force. They sent it into Lysychansk, where no doubt it will shortly be trapped with all the other Ukrainian troops who were there. I have never understood, I still do not understand fully, this Ukrainian practice of not just holding on to positions that are undefendable, but to repeatedly reinforcing failure. And one of the most extraordinary things is that apparently, in order to try to hold on to Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, the Ukrainians actually withdrew troops from the Kharkiv region and sent them to Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, where they had been, of course, rapidly absorbed in the battle and probably destroyed by the far superior Russians. And I've been saying over the course of several programs that the Ukrainian offensive, the Ukrainian counteroffensive northeast of Kharkiv, which had attracted so much media space in the Western media a few weeks ago, has essentially been reversed. Well, latest reports speak of the Russian troops now capturing even those villages close to Kharkiv city itself, which were the first villages to be recaptured by the Ukrainians in that counteroffensive. In other words, it's gone totally into reverse. That began to happen about 2 weeks ago, when the Russian forces in Kharkiv region were reinforced by fresh troops brought from Russia. But with the diversion of Ukrainian troops to Severodonetsk, that failure, that defeat, that retreat in northeast Kharkiv region, northeast of Kharkiv, that seems to have accelerated. And given that the entire logic of that offensive, or at least the explanation for it that I saw, was that it was intended to try to persuade the Russians to ease off their pressure on Severodonetsk by transferring troops from the Severodonetsk front to the Kharkiv front, given that that was the original Ukrainian rationale, apparently, for that counteroffensive. It's really ironic that what seems to have happened is the diametric reverse. The Ukrainians, this desperate Ukrainian attempt to hold on to Severodonetsk and Lysychansk at all costs, means that the Ukrainians have essentially thrown away all their gains, ephemeral though they were, from that much talked about Kharkiv counteroffensive, by redeploying their troops from Kharkiv region to try to defend Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Only, of course, defending Severodonetsk and Lysychansk is impossible, and these Ukrainian forces that have been redeployed to do that from the Kharkiv region have been rapidly destroyed. Now, there's been more and more discussion about the number of casualties Ukraine is suffering. The best estimate is that around 1,000 Ukrainian troops are being killed and wounded every day. Ukraine says up to 200 men are dying, that's to say killed outright, and 800 are wounded. That's already 1,000. That was what one Ukrainian official said. Others put the loss rates much higher, but there's already growing questions about how long Ukraine can absorb losses at this rate. And I read a very interesting analysis of these losses, which was made by a Russian blogger, but a very serious-minded and objective one. And this person suggested that what Ukraine has been doing by trying to hold on in all of these places is that it is sacrificing its best trained manpower. The officers and NCOs, who are the backbone of any army, are being sacrificed together with the best Ukrainian units, so that the new fresh units that have been created and thrown into battle lack that kind of professional combat leadership which is essential for any Ukrainian force, for the Ukrainian army to keep fighting. And this comes shortly after we've had confirmation that from various sources that Ukraine's armored forces have essentially stopped functioning, that Ukrainian troops are now operating without armor protection, that their tanks, their infantry fighting vehicles are very reduced in number. And after the Ukrainians have themselves admitted that they are now running desperately short of ammunition, with a Ukrainian official actually admitting that Ukraine is only able to launch across the entire 1,000-kilometer front line something like 5,000 rounds of artillery ammunition a day. Now that compares with the 1,500 rounds of ammunition that the Russians, according to a Guardian report that I discussed about 2 weeks ago, were launching each day against one small Ukrainian town. And there are reports that the Russians are launching around 500,000 rounds of ammunition at the Ukrainian army every day. Now, if that is correct, that gives us a sense of the extraordinary discrepancy. 5,000 from the Ukrainians, 400 to 500,000 rounds of ammunition from the Russians. That gives us some idea of the enormous imbalance in the fighting, in the military power of the respective sides that is going on. Now, all of this is happening against the backdrop of a growing economic crisis, first in Ukraine and then in the West. Let's talk about Ukraine. Firstly, the Ukrainian government has now admitted that it is spending twice as much on the war as it is receiving in taxes. Taxes have essentially collapsed. I did a program a few weeks ago in which I pointed out that Ukraine seems increasingly to be printing money or borrowing it from various Western institutions and Western governments. And a Ukrainian official has now admitted that even the amount of money that the West is providing is not enough to cover Ukrainian spending. Now, for the moment, the Ukrainian currency, the hryvnia, has held up pretty well. But I wonder for how much longer. And I do wonder whether, in the event that there is a major Ukrainian defeat in Donbass, which to be honest looks to me now like only a matter of time, whether confidence in the currency at that point, with this level of overspending, might actually break, and whether with all kinds of enormous consequences and implications for Ukraine and its people. Now, I would say that it doesn't automatically follow that during a war, a currency collapses. During the Lebanese civil war of the 1970s and early 1980s, it was really remarkable how stable the Lebanese currency, the Lebanese pound, was throughout that period. Lebanon has had periods of hyperinflation since then, during times of peace, but during that period of war, the currency actually remained remarkably resilient, despite the fact, as I said, that the country was in a state of civil war. So it doesn't automatically follow that because Ukraine is overspending at this rate and its tax intake is collapsing, it doesn't necessarily follow that the currency is also going to collapse. What sustains a currency is confidence. And one wonders whether the fact that Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, if it all comes together in a sudden big defeat in Donbass, whether that might undermine the confidence in the Ukrainian currency, which has been built up with much hard work over a very long time, and what that will mean for Ukraine if that does indeed happen. And we've also had further bad news from Ukraine, which is that the harvest this year is expected to be around 48 million tons of grain, as opposed to the 83 plus million tons of grain that it was last year. So Ukraine's major export crop, item, product, its grain harvest, that's going to be severely reduced. And in fact, we see that the entire Ukrainian economy is in very bad shape. It's losing resources. There is predictions that GDP could contract between a third and a half, depending on the economic analyst that you read. But of course, it isn't just Ukraine that is in a dark economic hole. I've been just reading articles. There was one article which said that around a fifth of companies in the Eurozone are in bad shape and might struggle to survive a recession, even a mild recession. There's, of course, growing inflation in Europe, in Britain, and in the United States. Interest rates are rising, but with supply shortages intensifying, there is a real possibility that that recession, which is on the horizon, will not reduce significantly the inflation, which is continuing to gather pace. So difficult economic conditions for the West, difficult economic conditions for the whole world. Russia, for the moment, seems to be something of an exception. The currency has continued to strengthen. At one point today in the Russian internal market, the ruble strengthened to the point where it was trading at 55 rubles to the dollar. That compares with around 75 rubles to the dollar at the time when the war began. And of course, it briefly fell to around 150 rubles to the dollar after the sanctions were announced. But it has been steadily strengthening ever since. And as the central bank chair, Elvira Nabiullina, said, there's been a rebound in economic activity in Russia. And inflation there appears to be falling. Well, all of this, military defeat in Donbass, economic crisis in the West, fuel shortages, energy shortages, food shortages, all of this ought to concentrate minds, or one would have thought so, and ought to make people ask themselves whether this is working out well, whether in fact the time has now come to try to do a deal. Now, I bring this point up in every single program that I make, because the logic of doing this seems to me so strong from every conceivable point of view. If you're Ukrainian or if you're one of the Western governments, you should by now understand that pressing on with this war, both the military part of the war that's been fought out in Ukraine and the economic war, is causing massive problems which are getting worse. And yet I have to say this, I see no real sign that the major decision makers in the United States, in Britain, or in Europe, and of course certainly not in Kiev itself, are prepared to rethink their strategies. And one gets the sense of a car being driven off a cliff with the driver simply putting his foot on the accelerator instead of the brake. I wonder how much longer this is going to go on for. Perhaps if we see a collapse in Donbass, a military collapse in Donbass, then that might concentrate minds, and we might start to see telephones being picked up and people calling Moscow, but doing so in a more realistic and conciliatory way than the way they've been doing up to now. Or it may be that by that point it will be too late, because of course the Russians may at that point start to say to themselves, well, the Western powers have treated us with astonishing bellicosity and hostility. We see that they can't be trusted. We see that Ukraine can't be trusted. We are winning both the military war and the economic war. They're not even prepared to acknowledge the fact that cities like Donetsk get shelled. So given that we're winning, why should we sit down and talk with these people at all? Why not just press on? Why not just dictate peace and decide for ourselves what will be the future arrangements between us and Ukraine? Well, with every day that passes, we get closer to that point. And I have to say that I think yesterday's shelling of Donetsk, if it has done anything at all, it is that it has probably hardened feeling in Moscow that any negotiations with the authorities in Kiev are a hopeless exercise, that they're not going to lead to any acceptable outcome, that these are not the kind of people you'd negotiate with. And for that reason, the best and indeed the only logical thing to do is to fight this war, as the Russians like to say, to a victorious conclusion. Well, if that's the fate that awaits us in the West and Ukraine, it will be one which, I'm sorry to say, we have to a great extent brought on ourselves. Well, thank you for joining me today for this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, but where we also invite regular guests. And of course, you can also find us on multiple platforms on Rumble and Locals. And remember, if you follow our programs on Rumble, if you watch one of our videos on Rumble, if you go to the top of the video, you'll see a red maroon button that will take you directly to our Locals homepage. And on our Locals homepage, we publish lots of exclusive content. We also publish, well, I do every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, my Wednesday live streams exclusively on Locals. And of course, we have a thriving local community which you can also join, and you can also publish your own content there as well. So that's you can join us on Locals, you can join us on Rumble. We're present on other platforms too, on the new free speech platform SuperU, on ODYSEE, on others. And if you want to support our work, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't also forget to go to our shop and buy our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our polo shirts, our bomber jackets, all those amazing things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.